I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Leanne Milburn. She's a landscape architect, a licensed landscape architect, and also a professor at Cal Poly Pomona. She's got national research awards in both the US and in Canada, and also a national teaching award for landscape architecture from the Council for Landscape Architecture Educators. And we are also married. So
yes.
Let me turn it over to Leanne.
Thank you, sweetheart. Can you hit the lights for me? Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some very general design ideas that will help you understand why people respond in certain ways to different choices that you make. So what happens when we're working on projects is we work in interdisciplinary teams. It's the same thing as you guys. And so what you end up having is you have someone on your team who is an engineer, in your case, a software engineer, a computer engineer. In my case, more of a civil engineer, a mechanical engineer. And then you've always got a designer on the team, and somehow you have to find a way to communicate to that person the basic structure of what you're looking for. And when you're not actually at that point where you're ready to work with a designer, you have to have some kind of basis for laying something down on a page or putting something into a computer and making those general design ideas. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give you guys some basic principles that you can use and apply to any given project. So one of the things that I say to my students is that design is like an onion. And so it's got all of these layers to it. And if you want to talk about the meaning of a design or the narrative behind a design, that's in the very middle. But that outside layer, you have to get past that first. You know, you can't just go straight to the middle. And the outside layer is the pure functionality of the thing that you're creating. And that's the case for you guys as well. It has to work first, and then we can talk about how long does it take to load, right? Is it efficient? Is it effective? Is it elegant in its process? I know he talks about your assignments all the time. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is there is generally no expectation when you're working with somebody that your designs are going to go into those inner layers. That's what designers are for. That's what you hire them to do. But for you guys, you want your work to at least work. It needs to function in the way it's intended to. So you need to at least have a sense of that outer layer of the onion. And I want to make sure that I'm really clear about this too, because some of the things I'm going to be talking about today are psychology. They have to do with how our brains respond to particular things and particular ideas. But these particular aspects of design are very much rooted in the geographic location that you're at. So I'm going to be talking to you guys today from a Western perspective. I'm talking from North American perspective. But if I was working in a different country, especially if I was working in Japan or China or Korea, I would be using and researching and trying to understand some very different fundamentals. And this is the Great Wave, and the reason the Great Wave is helpful in terms of understanding this is that we as North Americans read things from the top left-hand corner down to the bottom right-hand corner. So when we look at the Great Wave, we read the Great Wave as riding the wave when we look at it. It's like an experience of surfing because we're coming down from that top corner and sitting on top of the wave. But if we were Asian or from an Asian tradition, we would be reading the wave in this direction, which means the wave is coming straight towards us. We're coming at it from underneath. And so the wave is very threatening. And so I wanted to make sure that I was really clear at explaining that there is a context for what I'm telling you today, okay? So I'm giving you a North American context. But if you were working in another part of the world, you would need to make sure you understood that particular context. So the basic principles that I'm going to talk to you about are PARC, P-A-R-C. And that means proximity, alignment, repetition, and contrast. That's what it stands for. Proximity, alignment, repetition, contrast. So one of the big challenges when we're talking about design, when people don't actually know what they're doing, is they tend to take the information that they're working with, or take the things that they're working with, whatever those happen to be, and they tend to distribute them. So if you have 10 of something, they'll tend to space them out evenly across the surface. So if they have 10 images, they'll space them out. If they have 10 trees, they space them out. If they have 10 buildings, they space them out. And good design does not space things out across the surface. Good design creates clusters of things so that it's easier for us to read it. It's easier for us to read the information if it's in clusters than if it's evenly spaced. So this issue of distributing things across a space is what people who are less sophisticated in terms of their design eye do. So that's the first problem that we're going to talk about, is trying to avoid this whole idea of distributing information. So the first letter, proximity, P. One of the things we're doing is we're going to group things together. So we're going to take related information, we're going to group it together. So none of this scattering something across or saying, I have 4 pieces of information, so I'm going to put one here, one here, one here, and one here. Right? We're going to try and group things together and create those clusters. And what it does is it reduces the clutter, the visual clutter on the page. So if you distribute things evenly across the page, then your eye has to step. And especially if it's distributed evenly across both axes, then it kind of struggles with knowing where to go, right? Where do I start? Where do I end? Whereas if you cluster things together, then it helps provide some sense of guidance about what am I looking at and in what order. And we're going to talk about the other tools that you bring to bear. Nanu, for those of you who know it. Okay, and so when we're talking about North American design, we start in the top left and we go down to the bottom right. And that's how we move across the page. And so when you're talking about digital design, we talk about it as this F principle, where we start at the top and it goes across, and then we go down and it goes across, and we go down and it goes across. But the further down you go, the less tolerance people have for having to process more information. So people will read full lines of text at the top of a website, but once they've gone down the website, they'll read less and less and less as they go. And once you get to the bottom, they'll just be reading the headings. So when you're planning on where to put your information, you need to make sure that if there's something people really need to read, that it's right at the top, because they will go to the end right at the top, but less and less and less and less and less as they go down. And so this is an example. It's interesting, you guys have such a crappy projector. Well, we're using, at Cal Poly right now, we're doing a test of new technology called HyFlex. And I'm one of the professors that's testing it, and we actually have better technology than you guys do right now for probably the first time in history. But anyways, so the tendency, if you have like 4 pieces of information, is to put it in the 4 corners, or if you have a 5th, is to put it in the middle. And this is what people do who have not been made consciously aware of certain design principles. And then we'll tend to put the bold information in the middle because somehow we have the sense, okay, well, that's the most important information, so it goes in the middle. And the challenge when we're talking about this idea of proximity is to identify what can be clustered together and where to put it. And so you can see we take the 5 pieces of information. In this case, we cluster them in the middle. We put 2 of them together and 3 of them together, and it makes it a lot easier to read and a lot easier to understand. It also helps when we're talking about digital design, if you actually create some weight on the bottom that echoes the weight that was at the top, it'll actually pull people back up to the top, and you'll keep them engaged in your particular tool rather than having them bounce outside of that, right? So to keep them there as your audience, you use that kind of something to grab their attention at the top, and then the thing at the bottom reflects and echoes that, which pulls them back up to the top. So that was P. P is proximity. A is alignment. And alignment is one of the biggest problems, I think. I think for most people, if they can get the alignment right, it kind of solves a lot of the problems. So what people tend to do when they're designing something, you know, if you think about your resume or something like that, is you put your name here, and then you put your contact information, and then you put, you know, education or work experience, and then you might have, you know, other things that you've done, and you did work, and then you have this one over here, You might have the date over here and the date over here. And if you just look at it off the, if you don't bring a critical eye to bear on it, it's like, oh yeah, it looks okay. Just like with the assignments that Neil gives you guys, it's like, okay, yeah, it does the basic function of what it's supposed to do, but is it elegant? Is it efficient in terms of the amount of time it takes, in terms of the amount of resources it takes? And that's the same thing. So when we're talking about alignment, every single thing should be aligned with something else. There should be nothing that is floating in space. Everything should be aligned with something else. And so what you do when we're talking about it as a designer is you set these parameters, and they should be both horizontal and vertical, and you say, okay, so we're going to make sure that everything gets aligned, so everything is anchored to something else. Right? And when you're talking about alignment, small differences really matter. And so what will happen is a designer will come up with an idea, and then when somebody puts it in the computer, it'll be off by a couple of pixels here and a couple of pixels there. And what that does is it's just enough to make it kind of feel a little bit awkward. And you won't be able to say exactly what the problem is, but there's something not quite there, and it's because it's not quite aligned. And it's this kind of subconscious thing that we know. You couldn't tell people and put it into words, but you're like, it's just not quite there. And that's part of the alignment, is this whole thing of getting it and nailing it. Like, one of the challenges when you're working with digital things, especially with digital images, is they often have some kind of border around them. And so you have this kind of white border around things. And so what the computer wants to do is it wants to snap it into the grid, but it uses the edge, right? It reads the edge as being the white border, the edge of the object as being the edge. And then, and depending on if your white borders are different sizes, so it'll snap them and align them, but it's aligning them with a white edge. So whoever's using whatever it is that you're creating, they don't see the white edge. The white edge is invisible to them. What they're seeing is the black thing. So the computer will read this edge and say, okay, I lined these things up. But in actuality, for us, our experience of it is that this is not aligned with this. So that's one of the challenges, is you have to be conscious and be very deliberate about identifying what the perceptual edge of it is, not what the physical edge of it is. Right? Where's the edge that people perceive as being the edge? And then one of the things that I say to my students is I say, try and avoid full justification or all justification. So justification is one of those things that communicates something to us. So if you do, for example, full justification or all justification, you're pulling and stretching things to either side of the page. And so those white spaces between the words become inconsistent. And visually, it's harder for our brains to jump from word to word to word when the rhythm changes from line to line. And so what you want to do is try and make it so that those spaces are consistent, which is what you get if you have right justification, left justification, or center. Now, when we do left justification, what we call a left justify, the other term for it is ragged right, because it creates that ragged edge on the right. So we call it ragged right. So if you are designing something and what you want is something to feel informal or unconventional or natural, then that is going to give you a better experience for that than this, right? This is going to feel more structured, more traditional, right? Also more technological. This is going to feel more natural, more laid back, more unique, all of those things. And then, so the way that you justify things is part of the communication of your idea, but then also, if you're designing something primarily to be experienced across, or primarily to be experienced up and down. So a portrait orientation, an up and down experience is going to give you something that feels more urban. Whereas a landscape experience is going to give you something that feels more natural. So depending on how you want people to feel, you're choosing your other things, right? The font and the color, which we're going to talk about, but you're also choosing the primary orientation, the alignment, and how things are relating to one another on the page, or in this case, on the computer. So I wanted to use this as an example. So here you can see the alignment here. And this, in this case, there's enough information here that our eye actually completes the circle, and it's the outside edge of that circle that lines up here. And then you can see the line under those, and then you can actually see that the top of the pink diagonal lines up with the top of the capital letters up there, which makes it just a little bit kind of funky, right? Just gives you a little something different. Now, if you look at the Google symbol in the top left-hand corner, so what a designer would say is, well, yeah, it's Google, but we made it really small. And it's like, well, yeah, you made it really small, but you put it in the most important spot on the whole page, right? They put it in the top left-hand corner. And they made it really small, but they made it not align with anything else. And so they took that symbol and they pulled it out of alignment with everything else, so that even though it's very small and it's very subtle, it still kind of grabs you. And so these are the kinds of tricks that you can use when you're trying to develop a tool that will communicate with people or will modify their behavior in particular ways, right? Very subtle, very strategic. So I do recommend, for the most part, against using centered, right? Centered is what you would get if, your mom was designing a birthday card or something, right? That's what Aunt Gertrude would do for her niece's, wedding, right? Centered is what people use when they don't know what else to do. And so for the most part, you want to stay away from centered. Centered mostly is not very helpful. So then we've got left, we've got right. So right justifying can really work sometimes, especially if you have a really strong line as part of your layout. So say this was a really strong image, you could use a right justification to create and reinforce that line. And that would be one of the few situations that I would actually do that. The problem with right justification is that every line has to start at a different point, and so your eye is doing that jumping thing. So people don't like to read it as much. But in that one case, it can work because it's got a crispness to it that kind of overrides that awkwardness. And then we've got portrait, right? Contemporary and urban, and landscape, which is relaxed and wild and natural. And you really should, for the most part, stick to one alignment. Your resume or whatever is going to feel a lot cleaner if you're very, very careful and strategic. And if you're not going, centered, left, right justify, full justify, you don't want to be funking around with it. All right, so this is an example of the power of alignment. So you can actually see, hopefully, even though your projector is not very good, you can actually see that this line does not align with the image. And the line that's under the image does not align with anything else. And you can see the subtitle there does not align, right? The line up there doesn't align. The by whoever it is doesn't align. This doesn't align with anything else. This doesn't align with anything else. This doesn't align. This doesn't align, right? It's not just this way, it's this way too. So it's this and this, this and this, this and this, this and this. It's alignment in each direction of each element. And so this is the corrected alignment. This is the way the alignment should work, except I think this should be down here. But you can see here, that alignment is aligned up there, right? So the line, the subtitle, the image align with this dominant line, and then we've got a secondary line here. That line aligns with the author, aligns with the line, aligns with the outside of the text. And then we've got alignment happening there where the subtitle and the author line up as well. So that alignment should echo and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. So that's the difference between the two. And it's very subtle, but what it says to a person who's looking at it is it speaks to a level of meticulousness, a level of attention to detail. When I talk about this with my students, it's also about time management. Because when somebody looks at it and they actually know what they're looking for, they can see that you rushed it. That's part of what it says. So this is that idea of finding a strong line. There it is. This is that idea of finding a strong line and then echoing it and using it. So instead of using it this way, you can use it that way. And so you don't have to, if you're designing and working with your alignments, it doesn't have to be conventional, 2 columns, 3 columns, or whatever. You can use things like chunks of text to define edges and to create alignments so that this and this and this and this become these kind of dominant edges to the space, rather than having everything be 2 columns. So the New York Times and our newspapers are good examples of this, of this kind of repeated alignment again and again and again. So they have the columns, but then they'll have the images that go across 2 columns or 3 columns, but they still align with the edges of the columns. So even if you then had something, if you had an ad, the ad would be 2 columns wide or 3 columns wide or 4 columns wide, but it's not going to be a column and a half wide. So this, for some reason, in the human brain, this is something that we understand, right? We can get our head around it, this way of organizing information. Now, I should note that it's a bit of a puzzle to me why that and that aren't properly lined up. I don't know. Okay. Who knows? Same thing up here. You can see this doesn't align with this, doesn't align with this, doesn't align with this, doesn't align with this. And so what you really want is to have all of those things lined up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then this alignment, right? So everything should be lining up properly across and down. And the columns, if you're working with it, we think of it more as a grid, but the grid does not have to be the same size. Each of the columns doesn't have to be the same size. They can be different sizes, and so that whole idea of kind of contemporary or traditional, right? Unique or orderly. So if you want things to feel orderly and structured, you use columns that are the same size. If you want things to feel more spontaneous, use columns that are different sizes. It will do it right off the bat. Just that one decision will help reinforce that. All right, so R. R is for repetition. And repetition is one of those things that is kind of easier to do than some of them. So this is, the thing is, what people will often say to me is they'll say, I always wished I could draw, but I've never been able to. When I was in school, in my art class, the teacher would be like, put down the pencil and give it to someone else. For goodness sake, give me a break, right? And so I'm sure for a lot of you guys, that was your thing, right? That was your curse, was that you couldn't draw. But the thing is, I am of the experience that if you try really hard and you work really hard at it, you can get to like an 85%. Anybody can draw if they take enough time and they take practice and they have somebody to help them, they can get to like an 85%. That last 15%, that's the aptitude. That's the magic something that some people have and the rest of us don't, right? That's that like instinctive understanding of space, instinctive understanding of color. And so for me as a designer, I have that, right? I've been doing design ever since I was, ever since I could hold a pencil. I have an undergraduate degree in fine arts. I have a master's degree in landscape architecture. I have a PhD in environmental design. I'm like a designer down to my tiniest little molecule, right? But each and every single one of you guys could get to 85% if you wanted to in terms of your design capacity. So the thing with repetition is the 85%. It's like you can do it. It is not hard. Repetition is this idea of wearing the same color, black shirt, black pants, black socks, black shoes. It's like you are going to look like a designer if you wear the same color all the way from the top to the bottom, right? If you wear a pink shirt and a yellow belt and green shoes and, orange pants, you are not going to look like a designer. You're going to look like a tragedy, right? And so that's the whole thing with repetition, is you need to use the same thing again and again and again and again. And the secret, so everybody can do repetition. All of you guys can do repetition. It is perfectly within your power to do repetition. It's the contrast that's the hard thing. That's the C, right? And so the contrast is the decision when you're going black, 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 black to change the color, right? It's that moment of pop that you have to add in. And so that's where it gets really difficult. But you can certainly go with straight black, right? So repetition is something that's very doable for everybody. It's the contrast that's a little bit harder. So when we talk about repetition, we're using the same fonts, the same colors, the same alignment, the same spacing, and you do it again and again and again and again. And what people will say is they'll be like, oh, well, I thought it was looking a little bit boring. It's like, no, it was looking good, and now it looks like crap because you decided to change the spacing halfway through, right? So repetition, repetition, repetition makes things organized and unified and hold together and gives it a kind of branding, a visual branding that we instinctively understand. So here you can see on the left we've got repetition, repetition, repetition. On the right we have repetition, but then this is centered, right? And so what this does is it draws attention to this in a way that it wouldn't because it stands out. Everything else is very, very structured, and then all of a sudden that is centered relative to everything else. And so that makes that stand out. And that's the more difficult design decision, is how much is the right amount of that. But you could just do everything and have it all aligned the same way, and it would still look 85%. So contrast is the C, right? P-A-R-C, proximity, alignment, repetition, contrast. And contrast are my shoes. It's that whole thing of when you're putting together an outfit and you're like, got the navy shirt and the navy pants, and navies aren't quite the same, and you're like, crap, there's navies or even the blacks. When the blacks aren't quite the same? People always look at me like I'm a super geek when I'm like, the blacks aren't the same. But it's that thing of if the colors are almost the same, but not quite, stuff looks crappy, right? The almost the same but not quite the same is a big mistake. You're better to go with something different. And that's a big thing that we talk about when we talk about design, is the fact that it should be the same or different. Don't have anything be almost the same, because your eye will pick it up. And what your eye will tell you is cluttered, disorganized, messy, even though you're like, it looks fine. I don't understand why I don't like it, right? Why do you not like it? It's because of things like that. Very, very subtle. The thing with contrast is it has to be strong, but it has to be used very subtly. And it's hard. It's hard to judge that. So if you're doing something, you're like, I don't know if I can do the contrast thing, don't do it. Just don't bother. Go with the straight black outfit, right? All right, let's talk about some of the other things that you guys have to work with. So in terms of font, we've got the fonts that have what I call the feet, right? So that's a serif font. The serif are the feet on the font. And then we have a sans serif font, sans, meaning without in French. So without serif, which does not have the feet. Okay? So a serif font, a sans serif font, and then the way I classify the others is decorative and script. Right? So 4 categories of fonts. This is the general rule. 2 is what you get. And you don't get 2 of any one category. You get 2 total, and you can pick either this, or this, or this, or this. And generally, either this or this. So you get 2 fonts. You don't get to have 2 serif fonts. You don't get to have 2 sans serif fonts. You can have 1 serif and 1 sans serif. And usually, what we do is we make the serif font the body, and the sans serif font becomes the larger, the headings, the subheadings, and things like that. The reason is because serifs are actually easier to read to our eyes. They reinforce those edges of the letters, make it a little bit easier for us to read. If you're feeling really daring, you can add a 3rd font, 1 of these. But the problem with having 2 serif or 2 sans serif fonts is that almost the same but not quite problem. So that's why we say you can have 1 of these and 1 of these, because they're different. They're different enough that they don't fight with one another. So you get to pick 2 and have an accent one if you want. And then, if you're then like, okay, yeah, but I want to highlight this, I want this to be stronger, you use bolding, italics, font size, all caps, right? Use all of those other tools that you have to create that hierarchy of information. Color. Okay, color is the great wave, you know? Color is one of those things that means very different things depending on the culture you're in. So when I talk about color, I'm talking about Western perceptions of color. And so when I was talking to Neil about this lecture, and I said, okay, so, so tell me what emotions you associate with the different colors. And he's like, what? And I'm like, blue. What emotions do you associate with blue? And he's like, I have no idea. And I'm like, okay, work with me here. Blue, how does it make you feel? What is your instinctive response? And he's like, blue? And I'm like, okay, never mind, we won't use that. We won't use that exercise. It's like, okay, well, we'll skip the associations with color. And so, but there are these kinds of associations that we have with certain colors. So we see red as assertive and important and passionate. And we see orange as energetic and playful and affordable. And we see yellow as it's like lively and friendly and happy and attentive. Green is growing and natural and successful. So things like affordability can be reinforced with orange, and things like success can be reinforced with green, right? And blue, for example, is interesting because if you guys ever watch like political debates, and you see people wearing the suits, you'll have a whole set of people up on the stage and they're all wearing suits. And if you look at the color of the suits, they are not wearing black suits. They don't wear black suits. They wear blue suits. They don't wear gray suits or brown suits or beige suits or any other color except for navy. If you look at a political debate, it will be a whole stage full of navy blue suits. And the reason is because here in the United States, we see navy as trustworthy. And so politicians want that. They want that association, and so they all wear navy suits. So blue is trustworthy, comforting, relaxed. Purple is luxurious and romantic. Purple is also a passionate color as well, not just red. Pink is playful and innocent and youthful, and brown is stable and rustic and earthy. And then we have the black, which is powerful and sophisticated and edgy. So one of the things that I do is I do community facilitation. So say they're building a new park in your neighborhood, and they want to update the community and get feedback from the community on this new park that they're putting in. And so they'll have me come in and work with the community on trying to identify their ideas for this park and what do they want in this park and how do they feel about the park. And when I teach my students how to do this, I'll say, so what do you wear? What do you wear to do that? I'm working with the community, but I'm standing up at the front of the room, and I'll be like, you do not wear black, because I don't want to be seen as this powerful person. I'm trying to be, more about what they want. It's not supposed to be about me being up at the front of the room and being in charge, right? So it's like, so what color do you wear? You wear navy to be trustworthy, you wear gray to be professional, or you wear brown to be accessible. So color, we associate these characteristics with color. And so when you guys are making your decisions in terms of technology, you make your color choices in terms of what the normal average person is going to associate with that. And you have to be very conscious of the fact that you guys are no longer normal average people, right? Just like I am an alien in the rest of the world, you too are now aliens. You are no longer an average human being, right? You see the world through a different lens, through 4 years or 3 years or 2 years or however long your degree is of a changed lens, right? You have a different awareness of what you see. And so you have to be very careful about making these kinds of judgment calls based on what your instinct is, what you like, what you prefer, how it makes you feel. Because you are no longer within the fat part of the bell curve, right? You're now one of the skinny people at the end. Okay, so white is virtuous and sterile and healthy, and gray is formal and neutral and professional, and ivory is quiet and calm and elegant. And this is one of those things that Neil really hates is I'll talk to him about like, oh, that's a warm blue, or that's a really cool white. And he will be like, come on, he's like, it's not even a real name. I'll be like, well, it's vermilion, or it's chartreuse, or it's eggplant. And he's like, those are not color words. Color words are like red, green, blue. I'm like, yeah, but they are, that's, he'll be like, well, what color is this? I'm like, well, it's kind of a dark salmon or a vermilion. And he'll be like, that is not a color. That is not a color name. But the thing with colors, so when we talk about warm colors, they're colors that kind of associate with fire, right? Yellow, orange, red, right? So those are warm colors. And so they've got kind of a yellow base to it. If you ever did like color theory, you would realize they all have some yellow in them somewhere. And then we have the cool colors, which we kind of associate with things like water. So blue and green and purple, these are the cool colors. And in general, you can make those judgment calls. So if you're designing, you want something to feel warm and lively and accessible, you go with a warm color. And if you want something to feel refined and contemporary and restrained, you go with a cool color. But you can also have warm and cool blues and warm and cool reds and warm and cool greens because it's a relative thing. And so if you have a blue that has more yellow in it, then it's more energetic and less calm than a blue that has less yellow in it. So even those colors that we would traditionally say are warmer or cooler, there are versions of them that have more warmth and versions of them that have more, coolness to them. So you just want to be careful of that, because that's a way to choose colors that have warmth to them, for example, without having to constantly be picking the reds and the oranges and the yellows. So when we're talking about color, one of the things that is a problem for people in terms of design is they tend to want to pick every color. It's like when you're a kid and you get that big box of colored pencils, 120 colored pencils, and you want to use like every single color in the box. That's the tendency. People want to use every single color in the box. But for what you guys are doing, usually we're looking at 2 to 5 colors total. And so everything that you are designing in should be part of that 2 to 5 color group. And even the images that you're doing are going to tend to lean in the direction of those 2 to 5 colors. So what we will actually do if we have an image and we've got a particular palette of colors and that image doesn't have it, is we will color correct it. And we will lean it into those colors so that it has a little bit more blue or it has a little bit more pink. So it feels, even the image is reflecting that color palette. So we choose the palette. So you choose the palette based on the idea or the concept or what you want to communicate to people. And so if you're choosing that what you want to communicate is affordable and personable and accessible, then you might be using colors like orange, maybe browns, right? But if you're trying to communicate something that's more creative and innovative and funky, maybe you're using bright pink or bright purple, right? And so we use these kinds of ideas and then we use the colors to reinforce the ideas. When I have people who are struggling, when they're like, I just don't know, I don't know where to even start, right? How do I even start picking my colors? I'll say, start by brainstorming 3 words that describe the thing that you're trying to create, right? What is the person like that you're trying to create? And so poor Neil, I did this to him, and I said, okay, we've got somebody, they're environmentally friendly, they like to hike on the weekends, they're 55 plus, they do yoga, what color are they? And he's like, I don't think he even said anything to that one. And I was like, okay, never mind. Okay, we won't do that. But that's kind of what you're doing, is you're trying to say, who is my user? What is the group of people that I'm serving with this? Because in general, unless you're Google, you're not serving people who are 70 and people who are 50 and people who are 30 and people who are 10 years old, right? Most products are serving a fairly narrow range of that. And so you're trying to make your color choices in your palette reflect what's going to appeal to that particular user. All right, and then I did want to mention one of the mistakes that people who are inexperienced as designers do is they pick colors that are too bright. So they tend to be like, oh, I want something lively, and so they pick a bright red and a bright green and a bright blue. And those colors end up looking like, your 4-year-old chose them, right? Because the really, really bright colors just kind of fight against one another. You have to have that whole idea of contrast. The C has to be used very judiciously, very minimally. And so mostly what you want are colors that are fairly neutral, that have a leaning in a color direction or other, and then you pick something that has pop. And you guys are going to see that with the exercise. And then you want to make sure, I know that you guys have been working with universal design or accessible design with Neil. You want to make sure that the color of your text also is cleanly and easily differentiated from the color of your background. And a good example of that when it's a problem, for example, are the street signs here in California. Right? We have all of those highway signs that are all green with the white lettering. Everything, green, white lettering, green, white lettering. For senior citizens, for the elderly, that combination of green with white lettering is one of the worst for their aging eyes. And so we have all these senior citizens that already can't see very well and maybe can't drive very well, and then we're going to give them a bunch of signs that they can barely read because they're green with white lettering. And so you want to be really conscious of that, of those limitations that are posed by certain color combinations. And I did want to mention there are some really good color palette websites, so you don't have to come up with your own palettes. You can come up with I would suggest you come up with your words, and then you go and you look at the palettes. If you go straight to the palettes, you have no criteria to use to make a decision. You need to brainstorm first before you pick. You have to go through a process of divergent thinking before you converge your thinking. Right? So you have to open up your mind. What am I trying to look for first? And then let me choose one. And then I also wanted to mention that white space is really important. And white space doesn't have to be white. White space is just blank space. It's space that doesn't have information in it that's demanding our attention. So white space is the space between things. And it can be color, or it can be a texture or a pattern, or it can be even an image that isn't demanding our attention. And what white space does is it gives us a chance to kind of pause in our reading. So it's not requiring us to go this, and then 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 this, right? It lets us do that, pause, that, pause, that, pause, that, pause, which is a more enjoyable experience for us. And then whenever you're creating your call to action, your CTA, the thing that you want your user to do, right? Press that button or click that link. That thing needs to have white space around it. The thing that you're trying to get people to act on needs to have enough white space around it that it stands out. And it says, pay attention to me, I'm separate and different from everything else. And so this is an example of an image that's used to create white space. And so it's not actually white, it's black or it's red, but it's white space because it's not demanding our attention. It's sitting in the background and not kind of pushing itself forward and saying, you need to pay attention to me. Right, symmetry and asymmetry. So symmetry is when you have things that are the same on either side of a dividing line. So the dividing line is the axis, and symmetrical is the same on either side of the axis. And the axis itself doesn't actually have to be a line. The axis can be a void, and actually often is. So when we talk about this, what happens is if you have two of something, the eye automatically puts them up against one another and draws our eye through them. And so what you have to have, if you're going to design like this, with symmetrical, if you're going to do a symmetrical design where things are the same on either side and they pair up, is you have to have something at the end. Because if you have thing, that's the thing in the middle that you're going to pay attention to. That's why we do it. It demands your attention to the thing at the end. So if you're in a community or you're driving down a road and there's tree, the thing at the end is hopefully, a library, a government building, a great piece of architecture, and not a 7-Eleven, because it's setting up this huge thing that's like, pay attention, there's something awesome at the end, and it's not, right? Okay, so asymmetry is when things are not the same on either side of the line. Asymmetry is when we go out of our way to make things so they're not exactly the same. This again communicates a feeling about the thing that you're creating. So symmetrical design is orderly and conventional and traditional, and it looks organized. Asymmetrical, not symmetrical, looks more spontaneous and creative and innovative. And so just like you're choosing your orientation, you're choosing your fonts, you're choosing your colors to communicate that, also you're choosing symmetry or asymmetry as part of it. And so this is asymmetrical. The tree is on one side of the image and nothing is on the other. But this is symmetrical. It's got three elements with one thing in the middle. And you can see, drawing your attention to that center item. And so this is a symmetrical design. And this whole thing, Apple Pencil, there it is. The whole thing is directed at drawing our attention to the thing at the end. So that's what happens with a symmetrical design, is it specifically sets you up to focus on that thing that's at the end, the terminal view, we call it. the terminus. And just because something is asymmetrical doesn't mean that it's not balanced, right? And I actually really like this teeter-totter idea because all of you guys know that you can, if you've got two people that are relatively the same weight on either end of a teeter-totter, you can perfectly balance that teeter-totter. But even if you're the scrawny cousin who weighs 50 pounds less than the other person, if you position yourself just right on that teeter-totter, you can still balance that person who's 50 pounds heavier than you. It's just where you locate yourself relative to that center line that gives you extra weight or less weight. Right? So asymmetry can also be balanced while still being asymmetrical. So how do we do this? We use grids. Grids are a big tool that make things really, really easy. And the grids, usually, you're creating a grid that's not just this way, it's also this way. And the grid is how we organize the information, it's how we establish these alignments, but it's also how we make sure we have some white space, because some of the boxes should be white. So you place everything relative to the grid, and you make sure that everything aligns with something else, and you avoid those tiny little pixel differences that make the eye kind of twitch, right? And you make sure you have enough white space. So the other error, so the one thing that we tend to do, if we're not very good at things, is we kind of distribute them evenly across the space. You know, if we've got 10 trees, we place them so that they're all exactly the same distance apart, right? Sign of a bad designer. And then the other thing we tend to do is we try and put too much information together into one slide, and too much information together onto one page, too much information together into one snapshot, right? And so we try and pile all the information into one thing, and then it gets too cluttered. And clutter is one of the killing things in terms of design. So allowing for some breathing room, like the white space there, is really, really important and removes that sense of clutter. Now, I'm not a big fan of the border on this thing, but other than that, it's a nice design. It's got some room to breathe, it gives you the information, and you can see the grid does not have to be evenly spaced. So you're setting up a grid, everything is aligned, but it doesn't have to be 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, right? Some of the columns can be bigger, some of the columns can be smaller, and that's part of what's going to give you a sense of either innovation and creativeness or tradition and order. And then there is a math component. I know it's hard to imagine, and I certainly would never use that actual word. That's a 4-letter word for designers, you know, M-A-T-H. But Fibonacci, so Fibonacci, I know you guys use that. Fibonacci is a big thing in design too. So for those of you who forgot what Fibonacci is, right, the Fibonacci sequence is 0, 1, and then you add the two previous numbers together, you get another 1, and then you add the 1 and the 1 together, you get a 2. You add the 2 and the 1 together, you get a 3. You add the 3 and the 2 together, you get a 5, right? So that's the Fibonacci sequence. And this is a graphic expression of Fibonacci. Now, Fibonacci we also call the golden spiral, the golden mean. We've got a bunch of terms for it. But what Fibonacci does is Fibonacci can be expressed as the two previous numbers. So the 2 and the 3 gives you the 5, the 3 and the 2 gives you the 5, the 3 and the 5 gives you the 8. So you can express it as this graphic communication of this idea. So this is another version of the spiral. But in terms of layout, you can have the 1, the 2 of those, 3 of those, 5 of those. So we don't use a 4. We almost never use a 4 in design. Because if you have 4, what you end up with is something that says, pay attention to the thing at the end, right? You have a terminus. So the Fibonacci, what you can use Fibonacci for is to say, well, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to have 2 and 1 and 1, rather than having 2 and 2, right? Which would be that whole, creating that problem with that terminal view. In design, usually we'll use 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, We don't usually use the even numbers because it tends to reinforce that tendency to see everything as being symmetrical. Now, as human beings, people love these relationships. The 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. They love those relationships. Why? We have no idea. We do not know why the golden mean, the golden spiral, Fibonacci, which are all fundamentally the same thing, why they work for people. Why do they appeal to people so strongly? We don't know why, but we know they do. So, and if you look at nature, nature has Fibonacci sequences everywhere. It's a very common thing in nature and how nature is designed. And then my own research has to do with restorative landscapes. And so what I do right now is I would design a school garden for children with autism, for example. And I'll design it in such a way that it helps the children develop skills that will help them succeed in the future. Or I might design for a memory care facility a garden that's specifically designed to help people who have dementia stay functional for longer. So we know, for example, in a hospital, if you have a room with a window, you will go home 2.7 days earlier if it has a tree. 2.7 days. That's if you get your gallbladder out. 2.7 days earlier if your room has a view of a tree. And so what we know then, what the research tells us, is that fractals, in terms of math, fractals result in people being more restored. People feel healthier when design has fractals oriented with them. And if you have Euclidean geometry, people feel less restored. And Euclidean geometry is what we use as the basis of architecture in our society. So fractals are actually better than Euclidean geometry. So when we talk about math, we like chaos theory better than we like geometry. All right, so application. Neil, do you mind hitting the lights, please? All right, so what we're going to give you guys, everybody, oh, you're going to do pairs, right?
Yeah, so first pair up.
Pair up. One for each person, one for each pair, sorry, one for each pair.
Cards, come in.
Pair, come on. We'll play bunnies.
Ace.
Oh, no.
All right, you guys are going to get 3 handouts. You're going to get one handout that has a palette of colors. There's 32 different palettes that you're going to work with. Your second handout is a series of fonts. Your third handout is a widget. And then you're also going to get a straight edge. And you're going to get a set of 3 words. So what you're going to do is you are going to start with your 3 words, whatever your 3 words happen to be, and you're going to choose a color palette using your 3 words. Once you've chosen your color palette, you're going to choose 2 fonts. And once you have chosen your 2 fonts, you're going to redesign your widget. There's your widget. You're going to redesign your widget over here using the principles we talked about in the lecture.